This is Australia, a country lying on the outskirts of Southeast Asia, next to the countries of Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and many smaller Pacific island nations. But although not directly beside Australia, just 2,500 miles north is the geopolitical giant that is the People's Republic of China. This presents a unique dilemma. See, Australia is not your normal country. Most other nations in this region have conceded to being in China's sphere of influence and historically always have been. Although these nations have different cultures and identities, China has been the dominant power in this region for many thousands of years, resulting in a delicately intertwined regional structure centered around whoever the current rulers or dominant power in China is. But Australia is unique in this geopolitical dance. The thing is, demographically, linguistically, and culturally, Australia seems like a country that would best fit in Europe. It has a primarily Caucasian population, speaks English, and tends to align itself with Western nations. However, unlike the countries in Europe and America that it associates itself with, Australia is extremely close to China, and because of this proximity, is heavily reliant on them. But how does Australia deal with this delicate balance? And how, with recent tensions rising between China and the US, will the country's geopolitical strategy become increasingly difficult to maintain? The first human inhabitants of Australia arrived almost 50,000 years ago, coming from Southeast Asia. These people were known as the Aboriginals, and were closely related to the other various ethnic groups in this region. Although Europeans had made contact with the island in the 17th century, it was not until the late 18th century that Australia became a truly European-dominated island, with Britain's colonization and establishment of a penal colony along the eastern coast. In the following years, the indigenous people of Australia were almost completely wiped out by their colonizers, and Australia effectively became a European outpost in a sea of Asian cultures. This started what would be centuries of Western alignment, and even after Australia's long stretch under direct British rule, it did not break off from its European ties, and became a British Commonwealth country following its independence in 1901. Siding with Britain, the USA, France, and other prominent Western nations in World War I, and continuing to support these nations in World War II. And with Australia's support in both the World Wars, the bond became even tighter between Australia and its European counterparts. Only 6 years after the end of the Second World War, both Australia and New Zealand strengthened their ties with the US, signing the ANZUS Treaty with the goal of protecting the Pacific, in response to recent disturbances in its political climate from Japan's attempts at realizing its imperial goals during the Second World War. These treaties and agreements in the mid-20th century shaped Australia's geopolitical strategy. And because of these circumstances, Australia aligned itself with nations almost halfway across the world. At the time that this decision was made, it had little consequences, as European countries were the dominant powers in Southeast Asia, with the French still controlling Indochina, and India being under British control until 1947. These European footholds, combined with a weak China in the midst of civil war, meant that at the time, Australia seemingly made the correct decision when aligning itself with these Western nations. However, since the late 40s and early 50s, the regional power dynamic has greatly changed. After more than 22 years of fighting, the Chinese Civil War finally came to an end on December 7, 1949, and coming out of this grueling war as victors were the Communists, under a man named Mao Zedong, a name which would later be known all around the world. The immediate consequences of this were not all that significant, but this would quickly change. Take a look at this graph showing China's GDP from 1960 to the late 90s. Over the course of these almost 40 years, the GDP went up by more than 16 times, from 59 billion in 1960 to over 1 trillion in 1998. This rapid economic growth, coupled with smart regional politics, paved the way for their ascension. Recently, the decision Australia made more than 100 years ago to align itself with Western powers has made their position in the Southeast Asian region even more difficult. The new world power, that is the People's Republic of China, is now dominating that area's regional power dynamic, and Australia is now allied with their enemies. But Australia cannot ignore the power to their north. Take a look at this list of Australia's main trading partners by total trade in 2023. High up on this list are countries that you would expect. The USA is in the top 5, as well as Japan and South Korea, who are major allies with Australia in this region. However, in the top spot by more than double is China. This sheds light on just how difficult Australia's situation is. But How has Australia dealt with being allied with the enemies of their number one trading partner? And how will this strategy have to evolve with escalating tensions between China and the US? In previous years, Australia has been quite firm in its policy against China. As mentioned previously, they joined multiple alliances such as the Quad and ANZUS to counter the ever-expanding influence of China. However, when it comes to economic relations, Australia has mostly maintained a friendly relationship. For the most part, this has worked. In the past 70 or so years, as China's economy has grown, they've attempted to include more trade partners regardless of political relations between the countries. This has continued to the present day, and does not seem likely to change. However, the repercussions for countries who trade with China yet have opposing ideologies are becoming increasingly severe. In recent years, China has begun to realize the power they hold. In more than 120 countries, they have taken the spot as the top trading partner, all countries which now could be easily crippled if China chose to cut them off. And scarily for Australia, China has already started to employ this strategy. In 2020, China banned the importation of Australian barley, beef, wine, and cotton, just to name a few. The seriousness of this is understood when looking at the products, barley and cotton. With these two commodities, China makes up more than half of Australia's exports. So, what is Australia doing about this? Although they have previously attempted to maintain somewhat friendly relations with China, it seems they have largely given up on this effort, with China imposing sanctions and being non-lenient because of Australia's Western alignment. On the opposite side, Australia seems to have decided to move as far away from China's circle of influence as possible, strengthening their trade deals with Europe and the US and ending many previous trade deals with China. And this is really their only option. Tensions are continuing to escalate in the South China Sea, and China is becoming increasingly aggressive in the maps they put out and in the action they take to assert these claims. The US is becoming less and less friendly with China as a result of this, and Australia finds themselves right in the middle of it, in an increasingly polarized situation. Like many nations today, they are forced to choose a side between the two world powers, and for them it is clear who that should be.